The dog rose without being called. He crossed the terrace floor at a walk, unhurried, and planted himself between Vivienne Colt and Julian Marsh just as she reached across the low stone wall for his hand and let out one low sound that stopped every glass in the room mid-air. "Muzzle that beast," Vivienne said, not loud, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Nobody in that room thought to ask why a dog that had never once made a sound in 3 weeks had chosen, out of 40 guests, her. 3 weeks earlier, there had been no terrace, no glasses, no 40 guests. There had been a concrete floor and a row of chain-link runs, and a woman in a shelter vest telling Alma that the dog in run 14 had 2 weeks left, maybe 3, and that his temperament sheet used words she didn't care to repeat out loud. Alma had crouched by the wire anyway. The other dogs came forward, tails working, bodies pressed against the fence. Rocco stayed at the back, in the shadow, watching her the way a man might watch a door he wasn't sure would open. She had worked at Ravenscroft 6 years. She knew the particular silence of a house where nobody asked what she thought. There was something in the way this dog held himself that she recognized, not aggression, not quite fear either, a kind of bookkeeping, a creature keeping track of exits. "I'll take him," she said. And the shelter worker looked at her the way people sometimes did, as though the offer required an explanation Alma didn't feel she owed anyone. She hadn't told Julian, not at first. She kept Rocco in the small room off the pantry where the household linens were pressed, feeding him mornings before the house woke, walking him along the service road at night when the estate was dark enough that no one from the main house would see. It wasn't sustainable. She had known that from the start. A dog his size did not stay hidden in a house with 30 rooms and a staff of 11. Julian found them on the 9th day. He had come down past midnight, insomnia, though he never called it that, and found Alma sitting on the pantry floor, the dog's head resting against her knee. She braced for the question that would end it. Instead, Julian lowered himself onto the tile across from her, an odd sight. A man in a robe sitting on a kitchen floor, and asked, quietly, what had happened to him. "I don't know his whole story," Alma said. "I know he doesn't trust easy." Rocco hadn't moved from her knee, but when Julian shifted his weight, slow, unhurried, the dog's ears turned toward him, not away, a small thing. Alma watched it happen and said nothing. "He can stay," Julian said. It wasn't a question, he had already decided, and now he wanted a witness. 9 days before the party. In that time, Rocco had learned the sound of Julian's study door, learned to lie by the window where the afternoon light fell across the rug, learned, though no one taught him, that there was one particular distance he would not let anyone close without deciding first whether they meant harm. Nobody had told him to guard anything, he had simply started doing it. The way some things start before anyone notices they've begun. Alma noticed the evening Vivienne first came to the house on Julian's arm, laughing at something near the fireplace. Rocco lifted his head from the rug and did not put it back down until she had left the room. Alma said nothing. The last time she had spoken up about something she saw and no one else did, it had cost her a job she'd held for 11 years and a letter of reference that never came. 3 weeks. That was all it took, and all anyone in that room would later remember was that the dog had never made a sound until the night he did. The engagement party filled the terrace with light. Strings of small bulbs ran between the olive trees, and a quartet played somewhere near the pool. 40 of Julian Marsh's closest associates stood in small, shifting clusters, holding glasses that caught the light when they moved. Alma worked the edges of it, the way she had worked 100 parties before this one, refilling trays, catching a dropped napkin before it hit the stone, making herself the kind of present that nobody had to think about. Rocco lay by the kitchen door, 40 feet from the nearest guest, exactly where he was supposed to be. Vivienne moved through the crowd like she had been built for it. She wore something the color of wet slate, and touched people's forearms when she spoke to them, laughing at the right moments, a beat after the joke landed, never before. Julian stood near her, and when she reached for his hand across the low stone wall that separated the terrace from the garden steps, he took it without looking, a reflex of a man who had decided, 3 months ago, that this was simply how his hand would spend its evenings now. That was when Rocco rose. He didn't bark. He crossed the terrace at a walk, unhurried, the way he moved when he had already decided something, and he came to stand between Vivienne and Julian, close enough that the hem of her dress brushed his shoulder. He didn't growl at first. He simply looked up at her, and something in his stillness made 3 separate conversations stop mid-sentence. Then the sound came, low, not loud enough to frighten a room, but strange enough, flat, sure of itself, that every glass on the terrace seemed to pause in the air at once. Vivienne's face didn't change much. That was the thing Alma would remember later, turning it over, how little it changed. A tightening at the corner of her mouth, gone before anyone but Alma was looking for it. "Muzzle that beast," she said, her voice carried without rising. She had a gift for that, or find it a new home. A ripple of laughter went through the nearest cluster of guests, quick and a little too eager, the sound of people deciding how to feel before they'd finished feeling it. Julian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He put his free hand briefly on Rocco's head, a gesture that could have meant apology or command, and it was Alma who moved first, crossing the terrace with her heart going hard and flat in her chest, murmuring Rocco's name low enough that only he would hear it. He came. He always came, when she called him that way. But he looked back once at Vivienne as he went, and Alma noted the direction of that look, and filed it away with all the other things she noticed and did not say. "Can you keep that thing controlled, or not?" This from a woman near Vivienne's elbow, someone Alma didn't recognize, her tone pitched for an audience. It's a liability having something like that around children. There were no children at Ravenscroft that night. Alma didn't say so. "I'm sorry," she said instead, quick and small, already halfway to being forgotten. "He's not usually like this." "Well, he was like this tonight," the woman said, and turned back to her drink, already bored with the correction. Alma led Rocco through the kitchen door and down the hall to the small room off the pantry, and she sat with him there for a while before going back out, her hands not quite steady, her face arranged into the particular calm she had practiced for 6 years. Somewhere behind that calm was a kitchen in another house, 11 years ago, and a supervisor's voice telling her that some things weren't hers to report, and a termination letter that arrived unsigned by courier 3 days later. She had learned the lesson that letter taught. She had learned it well enough that she didn't need anyone to teach it to her twice. Mr. Pemberton found her there, straightening her collar in the dim hall mirror before she went back out. He didn't ask what had happened. The terrace had been loud enough that half the house already knew. "You did nothing wrong," he said, which was not what she'd asked him, and not the kind of thing he usually offered without being asked. "Whatever anyone says out there, you did nothing wrong tonight." "I know that," Alma said, though the words came out thinner than she meant them to. He studied her a moment, the particular look of a man who had run this household through 2 decades and several kinds of trouble, and said only, "See that you keep knowing it," before he went back out to the terrace himself, leaving her a little steadier than she'd been a minute before. She went back out to the terrace because that was her job, and she did the rest of the evening the way she did every evening, present in the way furniture is present. The party thinned by midnight. Guests filtered toward the drive in 2s and 3s, their voices carrying back across the lawn, already reshaping the evening into an anecdote. By 1, Vivienne had gone up to her wing of the house without a word to Alma, which was, Alma had noticed, the way Vivienne usually ended an evening, a door closing somewhere above, and silence. Alma was gathering the last of the glasses from the terrace wall when she heard the kitchen door open behind her, softer than a guest would open it. She turned and found Julian standing there in the same robe he'd worn 9 nights before, barefoot on the cold stone, looking not at her but past her, toward the pantry hall. "Is he all right?" he asked. "He's fine," Alma said. "He doesn't like being talked about like that. Neither would I." Julian almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive. "I should go check on him," he said, and went. Alma stood alone on the terrace a moment longer, an armful of empty glasses cooling in her hands, and watched the door where he'd disappeared until the last of the string lights above her clicked off, one strand at a time, and the terrace went dark. Julian didn't go check on the dog that night. He went to the pantry room and found it empty. Alma had already brought Rocco back to the small bed by the stove, the one place in the house that had come, in 3 weeks, to belong to him, and Julian stood in the doorway a long moment before he understood that what he wanted wasn't to check on anything. He wanted to sit, so he sat. On the kitchen floor, in his robe, at 1 in the morning, with the last guest's cars still crunching gravel somewhere down the long drive, and Rocco lifted his head from his paws and looked at him and did not move away. Alma found him there 20 minutes later, coming back for the tray of glasses she'd forgotten. She almost turned around. It felt for a moment like walking in on something private, though nothing was happening. A man sitting on a floor, a dog watching him with mild, unhurried attention. "You don't have to sit there," she said. "I know." He didn't get up. "Sit with me a minute, if you're not too tired." It was not the kind of thing an employer said to her, not in 6 years at Ravenscroft, not in 11 years at the house before this one. She sat anyway, on the low stool by the pantry door, close enough to see the exhaustion under his eyes that the terrace lighting had hidden all evening. "Why isn't he like that with me?" Julian asked. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the dog. "He's fine with me. He's fine with you. He's fine with the mail carrier, for God's sake." He picked her. Out of everyone on that terrace, Alma considered how much of the truth was hers to give him. She had spent 6 years learning exactly how much truth a room could hold before it turned on the person holding it. "I don't know everything about him," she said carefully, "but I know a little. Tell me." So she told him. Not everything, not the parts that were still only half-formed suspicions, things she'd noticed and set aside the way she set aside most things, but the part she was sure of, the part that had made her crouch by a chain-link fence 3 weeks ago instead of walking past it the way anyone with sense would have. "When I went to the shelter," she said, "there was a trainer there. Contracted, not staff. They bring people in sometimes to work with the harder cases before adoption. He was rough with the dogs, not cruel exactly, just impatient. The kind of impatient that turns into something worse if nobody's watching." Julian was quiet, listening the way he rarely listened to anyone, without reaching for his phone, without glancing toward the door. Rocco was in a run with 2 other dogs that day, waiting his turn. "I watched this trainer go in with a leash and grab for the collar of the smaller one, too fast, too hard, the kind of grab that isn't about training, it's about being annoyed and taking it out on something that can't talk back. And Rocco didn't attack him, I want to be clear about that. He didn't lunge, he didn't bite. He put himself between the man and the smaller dog, and he backed up, slowly, 1 step, then another, pulling the smaller dog's attention with him until the man had to either follow into open ground where the shelter staff could see everything or let go. He backed up, Julian repeated. That's his whole language, as far as I can tell. He doesn't fight. He measures distance. He decides how close is too close, and then he holds the line, and if you cross it he doesn't come at you. He makes you choose whether to keep coming, in the open, where somebody's watching. Julian looked down at the dog for a long moment. Rocco, as though he understood he was being discussed, or perhaps only because the room had gone quiet enough for him to notice, rose from his bed by the stove, crossed the kitchen floor, and lay down again, this time close enough that his flank pressed against the side of Julian's knee. Neither of them said anything about it. Alma watched Julian's hand move, slow, almost unconscious, to rest on the dog's shoulder, and thought of the bowl by the kitchen door that Rocco drank from only when someone he trusted was nearby, a habit she'd noticed the second week and never mentioned to anyone because it hadn't seemed like the kind of thing a woman in her position got to bring up unprompted. "He picked her tonight," Julian said again, quieter now, less a question. "Out of everyone." "I don't know why," Alma said, which was true, though she had a guess she wasn't ready to hand him. An observation and an accusation could look identical from across a room. The only difference was how confident you sounded saying it, and she had learned, a long time ago, exactly what it cost a woman in her position to sound confident about the wrong things. They sat like that for a while, the three of them, in a kitchen gone quiet and dim, the last of the party's noise long since faded from the drive. Julian asked her, eventually, about the shelter, how she'd found it, why she'd gone at all, whether she'd been looking for a dog or just gone looking. She told him the true parts of that too, the ones that were safe to tell, that she liked to walk on her one afternoon off, that the shelter was on her route, that something about the silence in Run 14 had stopped her feet before her mind had caught up. She did not tell him about the 11 years before Ravenscroft, or the letter that came by courier, or the reason she had learned to recognize a creature keeping track of exits. Some things you kept, the way you kept a coat in winter, not because you were ashamed of it, but because the cold outside was real, and you didn't take a coat off just because the room you were standing in happened to be warm. It was nearly 2 when she finally rose, her knees stiff from the stool, and told Julian she needed to sleep, and he nodded and stayed a while longer with the dog before going up himself. Alma was halfway down the service hall, keys to the linen room in hand, when she noticed the light. A thin line of it under the door at the top of the east stairs, Vivienne's wing, dark for the last hour, now lit. She might not have thought anything of it. People woke at odd hours. She woke at odd hours herself, most nights, the habit of a working life. But then she heard the back door. Not the kitchen door, which stuck and complained when it opened, the smaller door at the end of the east wing, the one that led out onto the service road, the one almost nobody used because it was farther from everything worth walking to. She stood very still in the dark hallway and listened to it close again, soft, careful, the sound of someone who did not want to be heard closing a door behind them at 2 in the morning, and she thought of Rocco crossing the terrace at a walk, unhurried, the way he moved when he had already decided something. She went to bed. She told herself there was nothing in it. Down the hall, Rocco's nails clicked once against the floor of the pantry room, restless, and then went still. It happened 3 more times over the following 10 days, and each time Alma made herself a small mental note, the way she made notes about laundry cycles and delivery schedules, a fact, filed, not yet a conclusion. The second time, she was up at 1:30 changing a light bulb in the hall closet, a job that could have waited until morning, but that she'd taken on anyway because sleep hadn't been coming easily since the party. She heard the same door. She looked out the narrow window at the end of the hall and saw, for just a moment, a shape crossing the service road toward the tree line, moving with the particular briskness of someone who knew exactly where they were going and did not want to be seen going there. Rocco, she learned the next morning from the low whine that woke her before dawn, had spent that hour pacing the length of the pantry room, unable to settle. The third time, she wasn't awake for the door at all. She only knew because Rocco woke her, not barking. He never barked, just a single sharp exhale through his nose from where he slept at the foot of her cot, a sound she'd come to recognize the way a mother learns the difference between her child's ordinary cry and the other kind. By the 4th time, she had stopped telling herself it meant nothing. She didn't say any of this to Julian. There was no shape to say it in yet, no sentence that turned 3 in the morning and a dog's discomfort into something a man could act on, and she had learned, a long time ago, the cost of handing someone an accusation dressed up as a feeling. But she started keeping the small ledger she used for the household supply schedule open on the kitchen counter a little longer at night. And in the margins, where nobody but her would think to look, she began writing down times. Vivienne, for her part, had begun a different kind of campaign, quieter, more reasonable sounding, and to Alma's ear, more dangerous for exactly that reason. It started at dinner, 4 days after the party, over something that had nothing to do with dogs at all, a discussion of guest lists for the wedding, now barely 19 days off but already, in Vivienne's hands, a project with the scale of a small campaign. Alma was clearing plates when Vivienne set down her fork with a small, deliberate click. "I do think we should talk about Rocco before the wedding," she said, in the tone of a woman raising a scheduling conflict. "Not tonight, but before we send invitations. If the Ashgroves are coming, and I think we want the Ashgroves to come, I'd rather not have their granddaughter within 20 feet of something that growls at people it hasn't been introduced to." "He growled at one person," Julian said. "Once. He growled at me, Julian. In front of 40 people." Her voice stayed light, reasonable, the voice of someone who had already won the argument in every version of it she'd rehearsed. "I'm not asking you to give him away tomorrow. I'm asking you to think, seriously, about what kind of home we're building here. What kind of image?" Alma, at the sideboard, kept her hands moving, stacking plates, wiping a ring of condensation from the tablecloth, and did not look up, because looking up would have meant Julian saw her face, and she did not trust her face, at that moment, to stay as empty as it needed to be. Julian didn't answer right away. That silence, Alma thought later, was the first crack she'd seen in him. Not agreement, not yet, but the absence of the quick defense he'd offered on the terrace. A man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. It was 2 days after that dinner that Pemberton found her in the flower room, where she was cutting stems for the hall vases, and closed the door behind him in a way that told her, before he said a word, that he had come to say something he'd been carrying a while. Mr. Pemberton had run the household at Ravenscroft for 19 years. He rarely spoke more than the day required, and Alma had come, over 6 years, to read the length of his silences, the way other people read weather. "I worked here when his first wife was alive," he said, without preamble, setting a small stack of folded linens on the table between them, an excuse for the visit that neither of them believed. "Margaret, she died 9 years ago this spring. Car, not illness. I mention that because people always assume illness, and it matters that it wasn't." Alma kept cutting stems. She had learned that stillness in her own hands sometimes made it easier for other people to keep talking. "This isn't how a house is supposed to feel," Pemberton said. "I don't know how to put it better than that. When Margaret was alive, this house had a temperature to it. People came and went, and it stayed warm. Since Miss Colt arrived, I've watched the temperature drop, room by room, and I couldn't tell you a single thing she's done that you could write down and call wrong. That's what worries me. A person who does nothing you can point to, and somehow the whole house gets colder. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only other person in this house who seems to have noticed," Pemberton said, "and because I am 71 years old, and I have exactly one card I'm allowed to play in a house like this before someone decides I've gotten difficult in my age, and I'd rather not play it until I know I'm not the only one holding it." Alma set down her shears. "I don't have anything I could point to either, not really." "Neither do I," Pemberton said. "That's rather the point." They stood a moment in the small, green-smelling room, two people who had each, separately, been keeping a ledger nobody had asked them to keep. Neither of them said the word alliance, neither needed to. "I've been writing down times," Alma said finally, "when she goes out, at night. I don't know what it means yet." Pemberton didn't ask to see it. He only nodded, once, The way a man nods when a suspicion he'd been carrying alone finally has somewhere else to sit. "Keep writing them down," he said. "And Alma, mind how you carry it. This house has a way of making the person who says something look like the problem, rather than the thing they said." She thought of a termination letter that had arrived, unsigned, by courier. She didn't tell him that either. But she understood precisely what he meant, and she nodded and went back to her flowers. And that night she moved her ledger from the kitchen counter to the inside pocket of her apron, where it stayed, from then on, close against her. It was 3 nights later, coming back from the service road where she'd walked Rocco past midnight, he had taken lately to needing the walk before he'd settle, that she found Vivienne standing near the east door, unmoving, watching her cross the gravel. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Vivienne wore a coat over what looked like night clothes, though it was difficult, in the low light, to be certain of anything except the stillness of her, and a particular coldness of her eyes, which did not blink, and did not look away, and did not, in any way Alma could name, explain themselves. "Couldn't sleep," Alma said finally, because someone had to say something, and it clearly wasn't going to be Vivienne. "Neither could I," Vivienne said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "It's a big house to be awake in alone." She went inside without another word. Alma stood on the gravel a moment longer, with Rocco pressed against her leg, and felt, for the first time since she'd crouched by a chain-link fence 3 weeks and 10 days ago, something that was no longer merely worry. It was closer to fear. The conversation that ended, it happened behind the closed door of Julian's study, and Alma was not in the room for it. She only knew the shape of it afterward, the way she knew most things in that house, by what changed in the air once it was over. She was folding towels in the linen room when Vivienne found her, a little after 4 in the afternoon, and set a single sheet of paper on the counter between the stacked towels, without a word of greeting. Alma looked down at it, a rehoming authorization. Ravenscroft's letterhead at the top, a rescue organization's name filled in below, not the shelter Alma had adopted him from, a different one, 3 counties over, the kind that didn't ask questions about why a healthy 18-month-old dog was being surrendered 2 weeks before a wedding. At the bottom, in ink still faintly wet at the edges, Julian's signature. "He signed it an hour ago," Vivienne said. "Before the wedding, not a day later. I've already spoken to the transport service." Alma stared at the signature until the letters stopped meaning anything, the way a word does if you look at it too long. "He wouldn't do this." "He did do this." Vivienne's voice carried no triumph in it, which was somehow worse than if it had. "People do a great many things, Alma, when they're asked to choose between a dog and the life they're building. I'd have thought you, of all people, would understand something about knowing your place in a house that isn't yours." The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Alma felt them land, felt the old shape of them, the shape of a supervisor's voice 11 years ago, a termination letter arriving by courier, unsigned, 3 days after she had said, out loud, in a room full of people who did not want to hear it, something she had seen and could not unsee. "If you go to him about this," Vivienne continued, folding her hands in front of her, perfectly composed, "if you make this difficult, or emotional, or ask him to reconsider, I think you'll find that a house this size has very little use for a member of staff who can't respect a decision once it's made. I'd hate for that to happen. You've been very good to this family." There was no hard edge in it to push against, nothing Alma could refuse outright. Only a fact, laid out flat and reasonable, the way Vivienne laid out every fact she wanted believed. "I understand," Alma said, because there was nothing else that came, and because 11 years ago she had learned exactly what happened to a woman who didn't say those 2 words when they were required of her. Vivienne left without another word. Alma stood alone in the linen room, with the paper still on the counter, and did not touch it, as though touching it might make it more real than it already was. And somewhere down the hall she heard Rocco's nails on the stone floor, restless, unable to settle. The way he'd been unable to settle every night that door on the east wing had opened at 2 in the morning. She found Julian an hour later in his study, the light gone amber with early evening, a glass of something amber too sitting untouched at his elbow. He didn't look up when she came in. "I signed it," he said, before she could ask. "I know you'll think less of me. I think less of me, but I signed it." "Why?" "Because I'm getting married in 11 days, he said, "and every conversation in this house about that dog turns into a referendum on whether I'm the kind of man who lets his fiancée feel unsafe in her own home. I'm tired, Alma. I'm tired of being asked to prove I care about her by handing over pieces of my life one at a time, and I know how that sounds, and I signed it anyway." He looked old for the first time since she'd known him. The tiredness of a man who has stopped trusting his own instincts. Alma wanted to tell him about the ledger in her apron pocket, about the times, the dates, the shape they were beginning to make. But she thought of the sheet of paper on the linen room counter, and Vivienne's perfectly composed voice, and the 11 years that had taught her precisely how much a woman in her position was permitted to say before the room turned on her instead of the thing she'd named. She had no proof. She had only a pattern, and patterns without proof had cost her everything once already. "I understand," she said again, and left him there with his untouched glass and went to find Rocco. He was in the pantry room, curled tight in his bed, and when she sat down on the floor beside him, he pressed his head into her lap without being asked, as though he already knew, the way, she was beginning to think, he had always known things a little before anyone told him. She sat with him a long time. The house grew dark around them, the ordinary sounds of evening fading into the deeper quiet of night, and somewhere in that quiet Alma made a decision that she would later think of as the actual turning point of everything that followed. Not the party, not the growl, not even the signature drying on a piece of paper 3 rooms away, but this. Sitting on a cold floor, with a dog who had chosen, for reasons she still couldn't fully explain, to trust her, and understanding that she was not going to let him go without knowing why. She would not go to Julian again. Not yet. Not with nothing but a feeling and a page of times scrawled in the margin of a supply ledger. But she was done being the kind of person who noticed things and said nothing, simply because saying something had cost her before. There was a difference, she told herself, between speaking too soon and never speaking at all, and she had spent 11 years on the wrong side of learning it. It was nearly midnight when she rose, stiff from the floor, and went to the small telephone in the kitchen, not her mobile, the old landline extension that connected to the staff cottage, because some part of her did not want this conversation to exist anywhere that could be checked. Pemberton answered on the second ring, his voice thick with interrupted sleep. "I need your help with something," Alma said. "Tonight, if you can. Not about the dog. Well, about the dog. About everything." There was a pause on the line, brief, and then the particular quality of silence that meant a man was already reaching for his shoes. "Give me 10 minutes," Pemberton said, and hung up. Alma set the receiver down and looked toward the pantry room, where Rocco waited, and went to wake him. Pemberton arrived at the kitchen door in a coat pulled on over pajamas, his hair uncombed for the first time in 19 years that Alma had known him, and set 2 mugs of tea on the counter with the particular briskness of a man who had decided, somewhere on the walk from the staff cottage, that briskness was the only thing standing between him and genuine fear. "Show me," he said. Alma laid the ledger open on the counter. 4 dates, 4 times, each one circled in a hand that had gotten less careful as the nights went on. Pemberton studied them a long moment, then reached into his own coat and produced something Alma hadn't expected, a slim, leather-bound diary, the kind the household staff had used for decades to log deliveries, repairs, anyone entering or leaving the grounds after the gates were locked for the night. "I keep my own record," he said, a little defensively, as though the habit needed explaining. 19 years in a house, you learn what's worth writing down. He turned to the relevant pages and set the diary beside her ledger, and for a moment neither of them said anything. 3 of Alma's 4 dates matched, almost to the hour, entries in Pemberton's log for a car passing through the service gate, not through the main entrance, where the camera caught every plate, but through the smaller gate at the back of the property, the one that opened onto the old Orchard Road and had for years gone essentially unwatched. "Same car," Pemberton said. "Or near enough. I never got a plate. Dark sedan, comes in around 1, leaves before 3. I logged it as a delivery irregularity the first time, assumed it was a mistake by the second." "It's not a mistake," Alma said. They sat with that for a while, the tea going cold between them, until Pemberton set down his mug and said, quietly, "There's more we could do than sit here with 2 logbooks feeling certain of something we can't prove." It was his idea, in the end, though Alma would later feel the weight of having agreed to it without much argument, that they go, tonight, while the house was dark and Vivienne was asleep, to the small office off the east wing that had once been Margaret's sewing room and was now, since the engagement, entirely Vivienne's, locked to everyone but the housekeeping staff who emptied its bins on Thursdays. Alma had a key. Every room in the house had a key that lived, eventually, in her ring, a fact she had never once had reason to feel uneasy about until tonight. They went the back way, past the kitchen and up the service stairs, the 2 of them moving with the exaggerated care of people who had spent a lifetime being quiet in other people's houses. Pemberton's slippers made no sound at all on the runner. Alma found herself counting her own breaths, and made herself stop. The office was neat in the particular way that told you nothing about the person who used it, nothing personal on the desk, no photographs, a laptop closed and a stack of wedding correspondence squared at perfect right angles to the blotter. It was the bin, tucked beside the desk, that told them something. Most of it was ordinary, used tissues, a torn stocking, the plastic wrapper from a courier envelope. But near the bottom, crumpled tight, was a slip of paper that Alma almost missed, and might have missed if Pemberton hadn't reached past her and smoothed it flat under the desk lamp. A receipt. Handwritten, not printed, the kind a small cash-only job leaves behind. No letterhead, no address, no phone number, just a name and a date scrawled at the top. Dale Prentice. And beneath that, circled twice as though someone had needed to remind themselves of it, a single line, "Balance due on completion." Completion of what? Alma said aloud, though she wasn't asking Pemberton. She was asking the empty room. Neither of them had an answer. They stood in the dim office a long moment, the receipt between them like something that might burn if held too long, and Alma felt the particular vertigo of a suspicion crossing over, all at once, into something with a name attached. "We can't go to Julian with this," Pemberton said finally. "A receipt and a coincidence of car times. He'd want proof, and rightly so. You don't accuse a woman of something like this on a torn piece of paper. We'd only give her the chance to explain it away, and a woman like that will always have an explanation ready. So what do? We watch," Pemberton said, "and we wait for something we can't explain away either." They left the office as they'd found it, the receipt returned to the bin, folded carefully back into its original creases, and walked the dark hall together in a silence that had, by unspoken agreement, become a kind of partnership. At the top of the stairs, near the door to Vivienne's private sitting room, Pemberton stopped Alma with a hand on her arm and put a finger to his lips, a voice low through the door. Vivienne's on the telephone, the words fragmented by the thickness of old oak but not entirely lost. "No, it has to be that night, not before, not after." A pause, listening. "Because that's when the household will be occupied with the rehearsal, and no one will think twice about, Another pause, longer, and then, clearer than anything before it, a sentence that Alma would carry with her for the rest of that week like a stone in her shoe. The night before the wedding, not a day later, the call ended. A door closed somewhere inside the sitting room. Alma and Pemberton stood frozen in the dark hallway a long moment, not looking at each other, both of them turning the same sentence over in silence. The wedding was 11 days away. What mattered wasn't the number, it was that the thing they'd feared for a week and a half was no longer hanging somewhere in the distant future. It had a date, and now so did they. 11 days passed in a kind of suspended watchfulness. Alma went about the ordinary business of the house, the linens, the flowers, the small daily maintenance of 30 rooms, and beneath all of it, she and Pemberton kept their separate, silent watch, waiting for the thing they had agreed they couldn't act on until it showed itself plainly. It did not show itself, not in any way she could have named. The dark sedan didn't return, or if it did, no one logged it. Vivienne's late walks stopped, or at least Alma no longer heard the east door, and for 4 or 5 days she let herself wonder whether she and Pemberton had built a conspiracy out of a torn receipt and a bad feeling, whether grief and suspicion, left too long in the same house, simply started to look alike. Pemberton didn't share the doubt. Twice that week he found her in the flower room and asked, without preamble, whether anything new had surfaced, and twice she told him no, and twice he said the same thing back to her, that the absence of a thing was not the same as its ending, that some people were patient precisely because they knew exactly which night mattered and were willing to let every other night pass quietly until it came. Julian, for his part, moved through those 11 days like a man underwater. The wedding machinery had taken over the house, caterers, calls, seating charts. A florist who telephoned twice a day, and if he noticed the particular quiet that had settled between Alma and Pemberton, the glances they no longer bothered hiding, he said nothing about it. Alma wondered, more than once, whether to go to him even now, paper or no paper. Each time she stopped herself. A man 3 days from his wedding, already worn thin by a fight over a dog, was not a man who would hear an accusation without evidence and call it anything but panic. Then came the night before the wedding. The house had been full since noon, caterers running trays through the service entrance, a wedding planner's assistant taping numbered cards to the backs of 200 folding chairs on the south lawn, the low hum of 100 small tasks converging toward tomorrow. Alma had barely stopped moving since dawn. It was past 10 when Vivienne found her in the flower room, arranging the last of the centerpieces for tomorrow's reception tables, and said, in a voice that carried no more weight than any other instruction she'd given that week, that Rocco needed to be kept in the storage shed overnight. For the setup, Vivienne said, the photographer's assistants will be in and out of the garden before dawn, and I don't want a repeat of the terrace, one night. It's not a cruelty, Alma, it's a wedding. She said it the way she said everything, reasonable, unhurried, already certain of the answer, and moved on to the next item on a list only she could see, leaving Alma standing among the centerpieces with a pair of shears still open in her hand. Alma wanted to refuse. She had no grounds to refuse. Not without handing Vivienne exactly the kind of scene she'd spent the last 2 weeks being warned against making, and so she led Rocco to the small stone shed at the edge of the kitchen garden, the place the groundskeeper used for tools and nothing else, and latched the door, and told him, in the low voice she used for him alone, that it was only one night. He didn't settle. She could hear him through the shed wall as she walked back to the house, not barking. He never barked, but pacing, the scrape of his nails against the stone floor, a restlessness she recognized because she had heard its cousin in every hour he'd spent listening to a door open on the east wing. It was past 1 in the morning, the last of the catering staff gone, the house finally quiet, when the fragments came back to her all at once, arranged themselves into a shape she should have seen days ago, the night before the wedding, not a day later. She had heard those words in a dark hallway 11 days ago and let them settle into the general shape of her fear without once asking herself what tonight, specifically, made possible that no other night would. Tonight the house was full of strangers coming and going. Tonight there were 200 folding chairs and a garden crawling with cables and lighting rigs that no one would think twice about at any hour. Tonight, of every night in the calendar, was the one night a car in the service road, a stranger near the house, an accident in the dark, would draw no attention at all. And tonight, Rocco, the one creature in this house who read distance and threat better than anyone with eyes, was locked in a stone shed 40 yards from where it mattered. Alma didn't think. She was already moving, down the back stairs and through the kitchen and out across the wet grass in her bare feet, the cold barely registering, her whole body narrowed down to the single fact of the shed and the latch and the dog on the other side of it. The latch had swollen with the evening's rain and wouldn't give at first. She threw her weight against it, twice, and on the third try it broke free with a crack loud enough that she froze, certain someone would come, but no light appeared in any window, no voice called out, and she pulled the door open and Rocco came through it like something released from a held breath, past her, across the dark garden, gone before she could call his name. She ran after him. She didn't know, in that moment, what she thought she'd find, only that the dog was running toward the house with a purpose she'd never seen in him before, low and fast and silent, and that whatever he'd heard or smelled or simply known, in the way he had always simply known things a little before anyone told him, it was already happening. She rounded the corner of the east wing in time to see a shape at the garden door, not one of the catering staff, not anyone dressed for a wedding, a man in dark clothes moving with the careful, unhurried economy of someone who had planned exactly how many steps this would take. He had his hand on the door, her lungs locked. She didn't know his name yet, wouldn't know it for another few minutes, when the security lights finally caught his face, and someone, somewhere, would eventually match it to a faded receipt in a locked office drawer. But she understood, in the raw animal way that has nothing to do with names, exactly what she was looking at. She opened her mouth to scream, and in that same half-second, before any sound reached her throat, Rocco crossed the last stretch of lawn and hit the door beside the man like something arriving from a different velocity of world entirely. The man staggered back from the door, one arm coming up too late, and Rocco's shoulder caught him full in the chest. Alma heard the breath go out of him in a single hard grunt, heard something metal clatter against the flagstones, a tool of some kind, heavy, dropped in his panic. The kind of thing she would understand only later, meant to make whatever happened next look like an accident. She was screaming before she'd decided to. Not words at first, just sound, enough to tear through the quiet garden and send security lights snapping on along the east wing, white and sudden, catching the man's face for one bare second before he shoved Rocco off him and bolted for the tree line. Rocco didn't chase him far. He turned back, toward her, toward the house, as though the man running was no longer the thing that mattered. The garden door flew open. Julian, barefoot again, in whatever he'd grabbed off the chair by his bed, froze in the doorway at the sight of her on the wet grass, at Rocco standing rigid between them and the dark, at the metal thing still lying where it had fallen. "Alma, what?" "He tried to get in," she said, the words coming out of her in a rush now, all of it. Everything she'd been holding for 11 days pouring out at once because there was no longer any reason to hold it. "His name is Dale Prentice. Vivienne hired him. She's been meeting him on the service road for weeks. Pemberton has it logged. I have it logged. There's a receipt in her office. And she called someone 11 nights ago and said it had to be tonight, the night before the wedding, because no one would think twice about anything happening in a house full of strangers, setting up chairs." She heard how it sounded even as she said it. Frantic, unprovable, most of it. A servant's word against a bride's on the eve of her own wedding. She braced, the old reflex, for the look that would tell her she'd finally said too much. It didn't come. Julian was staring past her, at Rocco, his face gone still in a way she'd never seen. A man watching a shape he'd spent weeks refusing to see finally resolve into something plain. "He tried to tell me," Julian said quietly, not a question. "The terrace, that growl. He's been trying to tell me for weeks, and I let her convince me it was nothing, a liability, something to sign away." Security reached the garden a minute later, drawn by the lights and the shouting. Two men in dark jackets who took one look at the scene and went straight for the tree line where Dale Prentice had vanished. They found him within the hour, crouched in the old orchard road behind the wheel of a dark sedan that wouldn't start. And it was there, going through the glove box for identification, that a folded copy of the same handwritten receipt turned up. This one made out for a balance still owed. Vivienne was awake by then, of course. The lights, the shouting, no one in that house could have slept through it. And Alma would remember, for a long time afterward, the particular quality of her stillness when Julian confronted her in the hallway outside her room, still in her nightclothes, still composed even then, right up until the moment two officers arrived from the county station and she understood, watching their faces, that composure was no longer going to be enough. She said very little. There would be more said later, in rooms Alma would never sit in, statements, a lawyer, the slow grinding machinery of a case that would take months to close even after tonight was over. But in the garden, in the last hour before dawn, none of that had happened yet. There was only the sound of a car pulling away down the long drive, and the county officers' radios crackling low in the dark, and Julian sitting down hard on the wet stone steps because his legs, he told Alma later, had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. Rocco lay down beside him without being asked. He put his head against Julian's knee, the same gesture he'd offered a stranger on a kitchen floor a little over a month ago, and this time Julian didn't just rest a hand on his shoulder. He put both arms around the dog's neck and stayed like that a long while, not speaking, while the sky over Ravenscroft turned, very slowly, from black toward gray. There was no wedding that day. There was, instead, a strange, quiet Sunday. Caterers sent home. Folding chairs collapsed and stacked along the south lawn. A house exhaling. By afternoon, Julian found Alma in the kitchen, boiling water she didn't especially need to boil, and Pemberton setting 3 cups on the counter, as though he'd expected to be included before anyone had asked him. "I owe you an apology," Julian said, "for a number of things. But mostly for the terrace, for Muzzle that beast." He almost smiled, saying it, the way a man tests whether a wound has healed enough to be touched. "I've been thinking about how long he was trying to tell me something, and how long it took me to actually listen." "You listened eventually," Alma said, "not soon enough." He looked down at Rocco, stretched across the doorway in a bar of afternoon sun. "I'm having the old orchard road gate rehung. Proper lock, cameras. I keep thinking about the back garden too. Margaret used to keep roses along that wall, before my time got away from me. I don't know what to put there now. I'd like to know what you'd plant, if it were yours to decide." It was such a small question. In 6 years, no one at Ravenscroft had ever asked her that. "Lavender," she said. "It comes back every year, whether anyone remembers to tend it or not." Pemberton carried the tea out to the front steps, and the 3 of them sat there through the long gold hour before evening, Rocco settling at last against Julian's leg with no distance left between them at all. Alma watched the light move across the drive and let herself, for the first time in 11 years, stay.